In most games, walking is a thoughtless activity. It's a given. It is your primary and often only means of navigation. For most games, it is imperative that this, the primary mechanic you'll engage with, is seamless, convenient, and should never make the player aware of it as a system. Making walking a process will only distract from other things, get in the way, and frustrate the player. Death Stranding chooses to disrupt this convention, chooses to disrupt the player. It's hard at first because it is so unusual to have to pay so much attention to walking. You need to be careful about weight distribution, the terrain, balancing your load as you move about, and the margin of error starts pretty slim. But learning a collection of game systems is pretty standard work. It is the unlearning that frustrates people. We are conditioned to a streamlined version of walking in video games, and we have learned to expect the walking to be a tedious necessity to let us access the cool stuff in an open world. And if you want the open world to be big, you have to put up with a little walking. But Death Stranding is the walking. That's almost all you do. Walk. And you have to unlearn everything else. Death Stranding is obsessed with babies. So it's fitting that the first few hours of the game consist of you learning how to walk. Like, really truly learning how to walk without falling over. You're also absorbing a ridiculous amount of information that seems like nonsense at this point, so it kind of feels like you're a baby dropped into a world you don't understand and you have to learn how it works for the first time. This first chunk of the game where you're primarily learning is captivating. Trying to piece together how this world works and what happened while simultaneously learning how to play the game is exciting and fulfilling, and, dare I say, maybe even fun. Then the middle 20 hours are brutal. It is genuinely a slog, draining, unfun, and infuriating at times. The only reason I ever got through it is because I had nothing else to do when COVID hit. Now, the game is designed to frustrate the player. It is intentionally overwhelming sometimes. It makes you feel like a baby, frustrated and incapable. The simple act of moving around is mentally involved. You cannot put your brain on autopilot without risking your cargo. Even in vehicles, you have to work hard to get from point A to B. Initially, vehicles seem like a godsend that will make the game so much easier. But the terrain gets more complicated in turn, and these vehicles become more of an annoyance and a liability than a useful tool. At first, it almost seems like poor design, like none of these systems were developed to work with the world that actually got built. But all of this frustration is very purposeful. My biggest obstacle wasn't the rough ground or BTs, it was overcoming my tendency towards solitude. When single-player games give me the option to indirectly interact with others, I usually ignore those features. I tend to play Dark Souls offline, and as a general rule of thumb, I want my single-player games to be single-player. And Death Stranding was no different. I wasn't really interested in the social aspects, so I tried to muscle through until I just couldn't. I rarely used traversal items because I had gamer potion brain about it and saved everything in case I needed it more later. I would try and get vehicles through terrain they were absolutely not meant to go through, and generally just got in my own way all the time. The experience is designed to be frustrating, but I was making it so much worse for myself by ignoring everything but the ground beneath my feet. In the back half of the game, you have to spend quite a bit of time without your BB, meaning you can't see the BTs trying to kill you. This, on its own, is a pretty difficult change, but on top of that, you are journeying into the game's hardest area to traverse: snowy mountains. The ground is steep and slick, and the thick snow drains your stamina without the proper exoskeleton, and whiteouts can easily send you tumbling if you're not paying attention. Being this deep in the mountains reintroduces a sense of isolation and claustrophobia that had slowly melted away as you explored the vast central region of the game. It is the most difficult area of the game because it piles on every challenge that you faced and places some limitations on you that force you to engage with the game at a deeper level than you probably have been. But you don't know what's ahead of you, and you probably aren't equipped to make an easy path for yourself. You don't have the resources to build tools to get you through every situation you'll need to overcome, and even if you did, if you overload yourself with contingencies, you'll have a much harder time traversing the challenging terrain. But once you're connected to the chiral network, you'll see things that have been placed by other players who were just like you. Other players that got through it and left help behind. A ladder, a rope, a sign, a like. When I played the game the first time, the bulk of my playtime was in March and April of 2020. Lockdown. So my memory is a bit hazy at this point, but I remember getting to this point in the game impatient, annoyed, and trudging through the snow to make a delivery entirely unequipped for this weather and terrain. I was falling all over the place, damaging cargo, getting swarmed by BTs I couldn't see. I was incredibly frustrated. But at some point, I found a zipline that was perfectly placed to get me where I was going, and all I had to do was build the other side of it. And then it clicked. I don't have to do this alone. Narratively, Death Stranding is a game about learning to accept the helping hands that are offered to you, and in turn, naturally extending your own. And this theme is perfectly integrated into the gameplay, operating hand in hand to provide a shining example of what interactive stories are capable of. The plot of the game may be told through cutscenes, but the story is told through the gameplay and how you as the player change the way you play and maybe even change as a person. Up to this point, when I was using ladders and ropes, I would pick them back up, save them for me to use later. Anything I could hold onto or keep, I would. But the thing about the zip lines is that they are only ever useful in collaboration. You obviously need 2 anchor points to go anywhere, and if you're just building them by yourself, by the time you place your second point, you're already there. It could be useful on a return trip, but I was only doing mandatory orders and I would not be coming back here. So when I came across that zipline in the freezing mountains that saved me what could honestly have been an hour of struggling, the thesis of this game hit me like an avalanche. The only way to move forward is together. How could I have been so stupid, so selfish? This whole world is connected and I have been refusing its help. I am just like Sam. I think I'm better off alone and I can do it all myself, but I don't have to. I shouldn't, and there is nothing to gain by struggling alone in vain. We are so used to treating accepting help as weakness or personal failure. We've learned to see it as copping out of the real challenge of cheesing the game. But frustration is the only reward for trying to muscle through the game alone. We've been conditioned to this, to move through life alone for the most part. We do everything in our power to avoid burdening others, or to do everything alone so that we can claim ownership over our achievements. As a global society, we talk big game about community and togetherness, but most of us are so alone. But alone, we have no future. It seems like such a simple, silly awakening to have, but the relief of finally allowing myself to accept help from other players and the character arc I felt myself going on in pace with Sam remains one of the most influential and memorable experiences I've ever had. There is hardly anything unique about the theme of connection or friendship. It's a pretty well-worn cliche to have the power of relationships be your strength in the end, but Death Stranding packages this theme in such a novel and bizarre way that when it is given to you, it does feel like a revelation. After this, I started building things everywhere I went. Started leaving things in shared lockers and leaving vehicles for others to hopefully find. I started rebuilding the highways and delighting in sharing this world with countless strangers I would never meet. I was finally connected. Across my time with the game, I've encountered a number of ziplines that were pretty useless on their own. The game didn't bring in the whole network, I guess, or maybe somebody just built one. But I was able to complete them, give them purpose, and hopefully both points would make it into somebody else's game, and somebody else could add on to that, and make this whole section of the map easier for everybody. And this is when the game started being fun again. Working with other players I would never see or interact with, players who will only ever get a handful of likes from me as thanks. Working with these players makes the game easier and more fun, and God, as I write it, I struggle to find the words for how profound this was to me, especially at the height of COVID lockdown when everybody was so isolated. The point of connection here was transformative. It felt like everything in my life was colliding at exactly the right time to remind me just how important connection actually is. And this is because of the unique setup and relief that Kojima had in mind guiding the development of this game. In the Hideo Kojima documentary on Disney+, Kojima talks about this experience saying, "The sense of loneliness is torturous at the start. Like Sam, we all start alone thinking we don't need help. And the game subtly pushes you to think like this, to relate with Sam and wallow in the isolation. So you play it alone until you just can't take it anymore. When suddenly, a random act of kindness from a stranger turns everything around. But because of this, it's the kind of art that asks a lot from you. Whenever I recommend this game to people, and I do all the time, I always include the caveat that I spent most of my playthrough not having fun. But because of this, because I suffered so much, the relief is unbelievable. It is transcendental, and by the time I finished this game, I could never be the same person I was when I started it. This game put me on the path, one I'm still walking, of trying to reach out, to connect to the world and the people around me. One of Death Stranding's major thematic elements is the critique of the current lack of connection in our world, and how despite living in an age where the entire world is connected by the smartphones nearly everyone carries 24/7, we lack community. At the beginning of the game, Sam is equipped with these cuffs that serve as a communication device with bridges and a tool that gathers Sam's biological data. They are literal handcuffs. The comparison to smartphones, which are always listening, always tracking your data, connecting you to the rest of the world, is unmistakable. Very little of Death Stranding's social commentary is subtle. It wears its heart on its sleeve, and its themes are slammed over your head again and again and again. But rather than having my intelligence insulted by this or being annoyed, I actually find it remarkably effective for the messages Death Stranding wants to share. Its themes are overt, but it isn't an uninquisitive game. It encourages you to question the relationships you forge, to examine the after effects of connecting the world and challenge authority. But above it all, it does want you to recognize the importance of genuine relationships with other people. We tend to think that we have to wait for the end of the world to enjoy our lives to the fullest, day by day. We watch all of these movies and read all of these stories about characters faced with impossible odds who, in spite of everything, choose to keep going, to live more richly than before. But most of us are never forced to make that choice, so we don't. We wait and let the days slip by like so much sand in an hourglass. We have countless works of art screaming at us, begging us to change the way we live, to reignite the blood in our veins, but we don't ever seem to learn. I'm going to oversimplify this to avoid spoiling anything, but one of the final scenes of the game offers you a choice between violence and love. Sam cries out,
Wait. I don't know what to do.
And the response is simple.
After everything, how could you not?
I didn't pay much attention to this line on my first go-round. There was too much else racing through my brain, but on my recent second playthrough, I found it incredibly affecting. It's almost self-aware in the way it acknowledges how obvious the solution is with the ideals the game espouses. If you have played the game, which mechanically and narratively begs you not to kill your enemies, it should be obvious that violence won't solve anything here either. The only hope we have against the inevitable is our unified strength, the strength of genuine connection. This is not a novel position. This exact message has been relayed an unfathomable amount of times in uncountable books, movies, songs, games, paintings, sculptures, speeches. I've heard this message a million times, but I don't know if I ever truly believed it until Death Stranding showed me why. Any story can construct a narrative that supports whatever ideological claim it wants, but Death Stranding is special because it can point at you and how you have changed the way you play. It's tangible. It is able to give you this fictional world that can frustrate you in a way that is real and then give you relief in a way that is just as palpable. Not everyone has had this experience with the game, I'm sure, but as I was writing this video, I wanted to see what other people had to say about the game. And nearly every single video I watched discussed this exact phenomenon of being profoundly affected by this buildup of tension and the eventual release when the value of collective efforts is made apparent mechanically. This effect is what Kojima so earnestly sought in the creation of this game, and while the story is convoluted, the game never wants to trick you. It is so obvious with its themes and messaging because it desperately wants you to get it, to look at the lives we all live and ask ourselves, what are we doing? Something I have decided of late is that I actually agree with the baby boomers. All this social media is destroying us. I live in a big city. When I walk around, it feels like I'm moving through a beach. We all keep our heads down, terrified of meeting the eyes of a stranger, haunted by the idea that they can see us just as clearly as we can see them. We are deeply afraid of coming into contact with people. It often feels like maybe the world is too big for us, or rather that we've made our world too big for us. We have a functionally infinite number of connections at the ready via the internet, and many of us have more parasocial interactions with online personalities than actual interactions with people in real life. The gas station clerk is more machine than man. It serves one purpose, and anything outside of that is extraneous. Something I found strange on my first playthrough was how friendly, or at least how conversational, all the preppers that you deliver to are. Unconsciously, I think I assumed this was just a slightly awkward way to flesh out the world or break up the loneliness of travel, but upon reflection and a second playthrough, I think it is actually a very hopeful gesture. Sam treats himself as the machine, as the gas station clerk with a single function, and his is to deliver. He never responds to the preppers, but they always talk to him, sharing personal details, fun stories, jokes, vulnerabilities, heartfelt gratitude. And your inbox is constantly stuffed with people writing to you, sharing even more of their lives. Sam isn't a machine to these people. And somewhere along this journey, Sam stops treating himself like one. He allows himself to have attachments again, to live, to love. None of us are machines. We have a need for connection, for intimacy, but so much of the connection we get through our phones is a poor supplement. We shrink into ourselves, isolate, shun the world around us because we can't control it. But the world in our computer is easy to control. Death Stranding wants to challenge all of this. It's a little ironic that it does this by purely virtual connections, yet somehow the indirect interactions I had with the players that I never saw or heard from felt real, human. Honestly, sometimes more human than the teammates I can hear and speak to in online games. And I think that this is because Death Stranding's interactions are centered around and limited to kindness. The omission of a dislike button in the game speaks to how easy it is to be mean online, but when that option isn't there, it's just as easy to be kind. You just have to learn how. This was a lesson I learned too late to make a huge impact on my first playthrough at launch. Though this year I played the game again and had a drastically different experience. This time around, I started with the knowledge of how impactful other players could be, and in turn, how impactful I could be to others. So I often tried to leave things behind, to donate any gear I wasn't immediately using. I spent hours pouring resources into the highway system so that I could make efficient runs between preppers and raise my affinity with them, but most importantly, so other people could too. There was a time in the middle of the game where all I did was standard orders for hours and hours as I built up this region of the game, and as a result, I had a lot of fun. This section of the game is originally where I fell off. I almost didn't finish the game at all because of this tedium. But this time, I couldn't put it down. There's actually so much gaminess to uncover if you delve into the optional content, especially in the director's cut. I knew I could never have the same life-changing moment the game provided for me the first time, but I didn't expect to still feel so affected by it. But this time, it was the pleasantness of reveling in the fruits of the lesson learned last time. As I worked my way through the mountains with the added haptic feedback really selling just how treacherous this climb is, I stood firmly on my feet, knowing that I was not alone and that I was infinitely more prepared than last time, physically and mentally. The simple fact is that the game is much easier and much more fun when you invest into the community and allow it to invest in you. My second playthrough didn't change my life, but it was really comforting to see that, at least in this one small part of my life, I have learned to reach out, to accept outstretched hands, and to unlearn solitude.